Federico, we are back with another episode of App Stories. I'm John Voorhees, and our sponsors this week are Crypto Pro, Delete Me, and Revenue Cat. Federico Fetici, editor-in-chief of MacStories.net. How are you?
I am tired, but also happy because I was able to get some writing done this week about a topic that I had mentioned multiple times before. It was one of those things that on App Stories, since November, I've basically been saying, yeah, this is one of those apps that I gotta find an afternoon and just sit down and play around with it. And I finally did it.
Yay!
So in this week's, thank you. In last week's issue of Mac Stories Weekly, our newsletter for Club Mac Stories members, I finally shared my initial thoughts and 3 custom actions for Taio, the text editor with automation features that originally came out last November. And ever since I've been saying, so for the past almost 6 months, I've been saying, yeah, I got to find the time to play around with this. And I did. So basically last week, I spent Monday and Tuesday essentially researching Taio, just playing around with it, trying to understand how its automation features work, how it differs from shortcuts, how it differs from editorial, which long-time Mac Stories readers may remember that application that came out in 2013, made by the same developer of Pythonista. Editorial is now discontinued, unfortunately, but it was the first. I will consider Editorial one of the first pro apps for iOS and iPadOS. Well,
right.
iPadOS did not exist at the time, but it was really one of the first examples of a desktop class pro app available on iPhone and iPad. And I wrote this on Mac Stories Weekly, covering Editorial and the review that I did at the time, which also became an ebook eventually. It was one of my pivotal moments in my career at Mac Stories, because I consider that a turning point in terms of, at least for me personally, in terms of the kind of writing that I can do, the kind of quality that I can do, and the kind of detail that I can pour into a single story. And Editorial was important for me because it opened sort of this entirely new segment for the combination of Markdown and automation. And Editorial was my go-to text editor for years. And eventually I had to move away from it because it was clear that the developer had stopped working on it, unfortunately. And I moved to IA Writer, which we talked about at length, both on App Stories and Mac Stories and all the things that I do with IA Writer. Now, what I shared in Mac Stories Weekly last Friday doesn't mean that I'm moving away from IA Writer. I'm not switching away from it. It's still my primary text editor. But like I wrote on Mac Stories Weekly, Taio is one of those things that don't come around that often anymore, which, funnily enough, it's exactly what we're going to talk about today.
Right.
But it's one of those new apps that has that special something, that unique feature or that combination of unique factors that make me go, this is something I want to keep an eye on for the future. And so I spent a lot of time researching its automation editor, and I shared 3 initial actions that I built for Markdown editing, for Markdown links, footnotes, and opening also links in Safari View Controller inside the text editor. So it was fun. That was only part 1, though, of this series that I have in mind. I already have some new actions lined up for the next installments of the series.
Nice.
And I think it's gonna be fun to keep up with this, because I know that the Taio developers are actively working on the app. They are pretty much open in terms of the roadmap that they have. They listen to feature requests and they are very active on Twitter. I know that they're working on addressing some of the issues that I mentioned in my column, such as, for example, you still cannot associate a keyboard shortcut on your iPad to an action, and that's going to be fixed. I know they're working on something that I have been dreaming of for a long time, John, which no text editor ever implemented the way I wanted. They are working on image uploads. And
Oh,
the
nice.
idea of turning a local image attachment into a web URL, into an actual image link.
Interesting.
I don't know how they're gonna do this.
Right. Where are they going to store it? Where's it going to be stored, do you think?
I think they're gonna build a system where you will be able to insert an image locally, just like you can do in Ulysses, like you
Sure.
can do in IA Writer, but they're gonna connect that part to automation. So you will be able to say, turn this file
Sure.
and run these actions, and then replace the file with this link,
Got
which
it.
is something that I've always wanted text editors to do on iPad. And it seems like it'll soon be possible. So to wrap up, I'm tired, but I'm happy because this is the kind of thing that I can keep working on in the future. And it's exciting because it's a whole new automation world for me. And so I hope that people will enjoy the journey into this new text editor, and let's see where it takes us. I don't know yet, but it's exciting.
It is exciting, and I'm looking forward to giving it a try myself. I've opened the app and poked around a little bit, but I haven't spent any time in it. And part of that is because there's not a Mac app, and I really do hope there's a Mac app at some point in the future, because I feel like especially certain classes of apps like text editors really need to be across all platforms to be useful to a lot of people. And I'd be really hesitant to move away from anything, especially IA Writer, which is so solid on all of Apple's platforms. I had kind of a similar week in that I'm kind of closing out the week as we record, a little tired from having published an article, a review of Adobe Fresco, which is a drawing and painting app on the iPad. And it's unique in Adobe's lineup because it was iPad first. It's not like Photoshop or Lightroom or something like that started out on the Mac and came to the iPad. It started on the iPad, and then it went from the iPad to the iPhone. And maybe it'll end up on the desktop at some point, but right now those are the only platforms. And on top of that, it's free. The vast majority of the features available here are available for free. I mean, with a Creative Cloud subscription, you get things like more storage and access to more fonts, but even in the free version, you have access to over 1,000 fonts. So, you're not gonna go through those too quickly. But it's what's interesting about it, and this is kind of, I guess, a little bit of a behind the scenes thing, is that I find reviews like this really difficult to do, and they are kind of tiring because, and I understand where you're coming from with Tayo, where it kind of sat untested for a few months before you got to it, because the same thing is true with Fresco. It's a very deep app with a lot of features that is not the kind of app that I use every single day. And so it takes a lot of research and work to really dig into it. And it's got so many, it's very good for beginners, but at the same time, it has so many features that I can't just write about every single feature like I can with some simpler apps, because it would just be too much. So you have to really understand, what's the angle going to be? I also happen not to be a professional artist. So I took it from more of a beginner's angle on how to get started with it. And that's just a lot more work in some respects than other reviews that we do. So, it was a lot of fun. I really like Fresco. Fresco is the kind of app that I'm going to keep using and fiddling around with and seeing where it goes. But it did kind of sit for me from mid-December until just this week, because I started out the year with a list of things I wanted to write about that, even if nothing else came up, would probably take me to March. And it did. So I've made my way through that list of things I'm absolutely going to write about. And now I'm kind of looking at the rest of the list and seeing what I'm going to add to it. And we're going to get, pretty soon, we're going to start getting busy, getting ready for WWC and other things we have going on.
God.
So it's really closer than you think. Right? Well, we still got a few months. We got 90 days or so. But in any event, that's kind of what I've been up to all this week. So,
yeah, these apps are tricky because they have a learning curve for us, and they seem like there's this barrier to entry as a reviewer, right? As a person writing about them, because you have to learn them and you have to explain to people how they work. If you're one of our readers, I think the benefit is that you don't necessarily have to do that research step up front, because we're taking care of that for you, right?
Right.
And
Right.
that's what's exhausting, but also the beautiful part of the job, at least for me, is like learning all these new things and making it easy for people to get started without having that barrier to entry, right?
Right.
Because you can just go in, read my summary of the things that I think you should know about this application, and then download the actions. And you don't have to do that trial and error that I had to do to put together those actions, because I've done the job for you. And so it's sort of that's the usually what we like to do at Mac Stories, but that also takes a lot of time. On the other hand, though, that's also why people like it, because you can
Right.
tell what, like, the actions that I share with people, they're not just like these demo actions that have like 2 steps just to prove a point. These are complex actions that I use myself and that I use for, as they say, production purposes. Like the story that I wrote about Tayo, I wrote and edited in Tayo itself using the actions that I put together. So it takes a long time, but I hope that people like it. And same with these creative apps that you often cover on Mac Stories. They are so daunting to somebody like me, for example, that when you just open one of those apps and you see those toolbars and those floating palettes of multiple tools and instruments,
Right.
but having somebody who took the time to explore them and to learn them, and somebody who gives me like the overview of the things I should know about, that personally, like, I find beneficial in reading like the Fresco review, because I now have a better sense of like the first steps that I could try where I to decide to use this application. So it takes a long time, but we also pride ourselves on providing that kind of work and that kind of service. Really, I see it as providing a service to people. But my time tracking is not happy this week for sure, because it's heavily skewed toward Club Mac Stories. And I mean, this stuff takes time.
Right,
but hopefully,
right.
like, you do it once. Like, for example, with Tayo being a series, like the next installments will be shorter and easier because it'll just be about building more and more actions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely the case. And yes, I finished my Fresco review, looked at my task manager, and realized, oh, well, now I'm behind on everything, every single thing else that's on my list. So yes, it can be hard to get those done, but it's also rewarding in its own way. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Crypto Pro. Crypto Pro is the all-in-one cryptocurrency tracking app. Use it to view market prices, read news, set price alerts, and monitor your entire portfolio. The app is fully native and supports iOS, iPadOS, watchOS, and macOS, where they've built a terrific-looking Catalyst app. There are also widgets for your prices, portfolio, and news, and Apple Watch complications, along with access via the Mac's menu bar, and even Siri integration, so you can ask Siri for things like the latest price of Bitcoin. Everything syncs over iCloud and is protected by Face ID and Touch ID too. Also, the app respects your privacy. No user data is collected by the developers, and sensitive credentials are stored securely in Apple's keychain. You can download the app for free, but to enjoy a free month of Crypto Pro's premium subscription, use the code AS2021. That will get you real-time prices, portfolio syncing from exchanges and wallets, advanced charts, curated market updates, and a whole lot more. Again, that code is AS2021 for a free month of Crypto Pro's premium service. Crypto Pro also has a great stock portfolio app coming very soon. You can sign up to get notified of the launch when you use the link in the show notes or join the test flight beta. Our thanks to Crypto Pro for their support of the show. All right, Federico, let's move on and talk about this week's topic. Why don't you introduce it for us?
Okay, so you wanted to go back to a topic that I first sort of offhandedly shared on iMessage a few months ago. The Mike wanted to revisit recently on Connected, which is the idea of, are there any new exciting apps on the App Store anymore? Are there any good new apps? Why, and this was a question that I posed months ago, why has it become so difficult for me to be surprised? I feel like I'm not excited about new apps anymore. That was a feeling that I shared few months ago, before the Christmas break for sure. I think it was after I published my iOS 14 review, and it was something that I had been mulling over for a while. And I talked about this in a segment of Connected recently, and we wanted to sort of discuss this more in depth on App Stories and share our experiences, because we trying new apps and browsing the App Store is what we do for for a living on a daily basis. And I think I'm ever since it's a complex topic, because
It is.
I didn't mean to imply that I don't use any new apps anymore, or that I don't get excited anymore, period. I meant more in a sense of my threshold for being impressed by something new is higher than it used to be. And I sort of wanted to dissect this, and why is that the case?
Right. And I think the fact that you and I do this for a living is part of the problem. If you consider it a problem, in that, you've been trying apps for a decade plus, right? And it's very hard to surprise someone who's been hip deep in the App Store for that many years. I mean, we spend day after day looking at hundreds of apps, thousands of apps every single year. And so I think it's easy to kind of feel that way when you've seen so many different apps. Now, I also think that part of it, and I'll start off with my diagnosis, which is what I told you, is that I think you have a bit of it's like a seasonal thing. It's a bit of a WWDC hangover, in the sense that, WWDC rolls around, we get new OSs, we get new technologies from Apple. Developers tell us about all these cool things they're working on. We test them out over the summer and into the fall. And then we get past the holidays, right? We get past the winter holidays, and things slow down. And there's, now by that point, you and I have been using Apple's latest OSs since the June before, so far longer than most people. And we've seen a lot of the apps that are taking advantage of those new technologies for months and months before they're even out. And in the winter and early spring, things are just slower, and there aren't as many surprises that time of year. So I think it's partly that, but I do realize that it's not entirely that.
Yeah, I think it's true to an extent. I think there's definitely that sense of I've been using this thing for so long, and I've been using all these new apps, and everything is sort of blending together in my mind, and I don't feel like there's anything new that stands out to me. It's definitely part of a seasonal thing, which you can also see in things like, I said this for fun a bunch of times before, but it's actually something that I truly believe in. You can tell that there's a certain seasonality to certain stories about Apple, and specifically the iPad. I would be willing to bet that we're now approaching the moment where there's going to be another controversy that usually starts from a blog post that somebody publishes about how the iPad cannot be a replacement for a computer. Usually happens in the spring, and it happens again like a month after WWDC, because somebody is unhappy with the changes to iPadOS, and it tends to happen again in October and November. So spring, July, and the fall. Yes. There's a certain seasonality to that. And so that seasonality I also see in myself for another thing, which is I need to take some time off the App Store and iOS and iPadOS, because it's only like the only thing I've been looking at. Like, imagine spending 3 months every summer, every single day, so 90 days just thinking about iOS and iPadOS and trying to document every little thing and design change and feature. Like, it gets tiring, and you need a change of scenery. And that reflects upon like the apps that I use and my excitement toward them. But that passes usually. I just need to take like a break for a week and play video games, and I'm fine.
Right. Right.
Or take a vacation, which unfortunately last year I was not able to do because of COVID. But also the thing that you mentioned about how the App Store is over a decade old, and I've been doing this effectively since the App Store started. Like, I started App Stories in 2009. The App Store opened the year before. So I've been here for the whole ride, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's only natural that you reach a point where it's not just about using the iPhone and using the App Store. It's also about the fact that writing about apps is my job. And you kind of get to the point where you may think, well, I've seen it all. I've done it all. I've tested thousands of apps. I've talked to hundreds of developers. I've seen everything that I needed to see. I'm bored. I'm tired. And, nothing is new and exciting anymore, which again, is not how I feel. But I think there's a component of that in thinking, why is it so more difficult than before to get excited about everything? So
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to compare to how I used to be years ago, because I think it's interesting to consider that. When I was younger and when Mac Stories was like a year old or a couple of years old, it was easier to get excited about new apps because, in fact, everything was new back then, right?
Right.
The first RSS reader for iPhone, the first Twitter client, the first calculator, like everything was literally new. And so it's only natural that when everything is new, new is exciting. There's this scene in Mad Men when Don Draper explains the idea of new, right? New in advertising creates this itch, this curiosity, this excitement, right? Because it's exciting. It gets your imagination going. And so when everything is new, I think it's only natural that you want to try everything and you want to be surprised by everything. And so years ago, some people made fun of the fact that I wanted to write about and test all of the apps, and my home screen was always changing. But that was obvious because the App Store was exploding, right?
Sure.
Everybody was making apps. And now it's not that the App Store has slowed down. It's not that, and again, these are like basically all my thoughts and feelings. It's not that I have, at least I don't think I've become like an old person, like, get off my lawn, new developers, I don't
Right.
care about you. It's not that. It's just some ideas, a lot of them are just not new anymore. It's just it's natural because, like, how many calendar clients have we tested? How many RSS readers have we? Like, some things have been done before. And it's not my fault. It's not the developer's fault. It's just what the state of the market.
Yeah. I think you're hitting on a couple of different things. One is a certain level of, I guess I call it app cynicism, where it's very easy when you've done something for a long time to start feeling that way. And I feel that, and I combat it. I mean, because I think neither one of us are really cynical people, but when you've seen so many of the same thing over and over again, it's easy to start sliding down that path. And so I actively kind of try to avoid that. But the other aspect of it is the App Store itself. There are just so many apps. There are over 1 million apps, and it's been around for a decade. And you're right. I mean, it used to be that a minimalist calendar app would seem really exciting and new because it was a new take on a calendar, something that was super simple. But now you look at a minimalist calendar app and you say to yourself, well, is it minimalist, or did the developer just not put in all the features that people want? You know what I mean? That's probably a little bit cynical, but it's also kind of true in some respects too, because how many minimal calendar apps do you really need? And if you're not going to, and if there's already a really good minimalist calendar app out there, well, what are you going to be? Are you going to become the next Fantastical? But you don't really want to, you can't really just be the next Fantastical. You have to be the next Fantastical Plus, because, there already is a Fantastical. And I think about this because I was talking recently to a developer who's working on an app that has aspects of it that are a little bit like, it's kind of a read later app. And it had aspects of it that are similar to Reader. And, I was trying to describe what it is that I think I'd like to see in an app like this. And my response was basically Reader, but a whole lot better. And it's like, well, that's an awfully tall order, right? I mean, Reader's been around since basically the beginning of the App Store practically. And it's been refined over many, many years. And that's, I think, a very high hurdle for a lot of developers now. It's not easy to just kind of come in, slide into a niche, and and create an app that serves that today, because it's, those corners are all crowded now. And if you want to do something that's a little more robust and that supports business model that's sustainable, then you got to do something more complex. And if you do that, though, you're facing teams, your competition is teams of developers who have been around for years and done some really fine work. And it's hard to become the next Fantastical or the next Spark, or, for that matter, the next, but then we will talk about some of the ones that have surprised us. But I think as a result, it's very hard to stand out today. And I know we've talked about this in the past, but that's a big part of it. And I think it's both that it's a more crowded place on the App Store, and there are a lot of established big players that are kind of considered the leaders of their particular category.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, because the more I think about this, the more I also realize how, in addition to the fact that the App Store is older and we are older and there's a lot more competition, is also the fact that I personally have, compared to a decade ago, I have much higher requirements when it comes to apps that I want to use on a daily basis, whether it's for work or for pleasure. Because, there's some apps that have been updated throughout the years. You mentioned Fantastical and Reader. Those are fantastic examples, right, of mature and flexible applications that have grown over the years. And they're now so powerful and so polished because they have that experience. They have that degree of maturity that we appreciate. But if you're a new developer coming into this, right, it becomes very difficult to meet that level of polish and flexibility, customization, power user features in a 1.0 release. It's very, very difficult. And so it becomes all about this tricky balance, I believe, of trying to do more than the minimalistic approach is fine. We've seen thousands of minimalistic apps. And I think it's much harder instead to try and do, okay, there's a bunch of apps that do what I would like my application to do. How can you find a balance of having lots of features, trying to work for both novice users and power users, having a unique design, having a modern design, which we talked about on App Stories before, having support for customization features, whether it's about the UI or the icon or customizing elements like sidebars and toolbars. Plus, I think you gotta have that special something else, right? Which is impossible to quantify. It's impossible to categorize also, because that special something else is unique to your app. And it could be the special syntax for adding blocks in Craft, or it could be the blend of automation and markdown in Taio. But I think now more than ever, you need to have that one thing that makes you stand out. And then everything else, the modern design, the features, the modern business model, the customization, the power user options, the adopting modern APIs like multi-window and file bookmarks, all of that is now, unfortunately, for a new developer, the standard of the market. But I still think it's important to have a mix of those like standard features and that's something else which is unique to you as a developer, which is you. It's impossible to say you got to do this, right? And so the importance of the unique idea, I still think it matters a lot. Even though there's the requirements for features and design and integrations and APIs, but there's still the importance of the idea itself, which, as we'll see in a few minutes, we've collected a bunch of examples of apps that we're able to have since the beginning, or maybe to find along the way, because it's also possible to find that special something else after a while. I think it's totally possible. But we've collected some examples of apps that have that special something else that makes them stand out.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Delete Me. Have you ever Googled yourself? It can be wild to see how much private information is available about you on the internet for everybody to see. There's an entire shady world of companies out there that collect and sell your personal information too. They're called data brokers, and they know your phone number, home address, political affiliations, and even things like your dating preferences. An average data broker can possess about 1,500 data points about each person. Think about how much information that is about you. And it's that kind of data that can be used for cyberstalking, doxing, and identity theft. The good news is that you can take one simple step to remove yourself from the majority of these data brokers. You can use Delete Me. Think of Delete Me as an anti-data broker. They've removed millions and millions of records from data brokers for the last 12 years, and they continue to fight for the user's right to privacy. This is an incredibly valuable service. I wouldn't know where to start, and even if I could figure it out, it would be a huge project. Instead, just fill out some information about yourself on Delete Me's website, like your email addresses and other data that might have been sold by brokers, and they take care of everything. This is something I'd never find the time or energy to do myself, so it's great that there's a service like Delete Me to take care of all of this for you. If you want to make sure your data stays yours, head on over to joindeleteme.com/appstories and use App Stories for 20% off. That's a great deal. Again, that URL is joindeleteme.com/appstories and the code appstories for a 20% discount. Our thanks to Delete Me for their support of the show. I want to talk to you too about some of these modern APIs, things like Swift UI, and whether that has become part of the problem. But before we do that, I do want to mention a couple of apps that I think do stand out in a crowd of very samey apps. And that is because, sometimes the reason a lot of apps are similar is because they're all relying on the exact same APIs. And I think one of the best examples of that is Track TV, because there are an awful lot of TV tracking apps out there on the App Store, and they all do basically the same thing. And it's apps like that where I think the design and the thoughtfulness of the user experience really is the place where there can be innovation. And the app to me that stands out in that crowd is TV Forecast by Matt Comey, because I think it doesn't do anything I don't think that some other TV tracking app probably also does. But the way it's designed and the way it looks and the way it makes it easy to kind of move through the app really sets it apart in my book. And it's why it's an app that I've been using for a long time. And I think Game Track is a lot like that too, because Game Track is another app that's, using various APIs available in the video game industry to allow you to create, lists of the games you're playing, the games you want to play, that sort of thing. But it's not so, there are plenty of apps that can do that kind of thing. But I think what makes that app unique is the way that it's presented and the way it understands the way people who enjoy video games want to organize their materials. And so while someone else may have a game tracking app that relies on the same sources for things like cover art for the games and that sort of thing, I think Game Track really does an excellent job of setting itself apart by the way it allows you to create lists and has kind of a social aspect. And there's a lot of other unique features of it that we've written about in the past. But yeah, it's that kind of thing that I think, even though there may be a lot of competition because there happens to be a free API for something, there are still opportunities to be different than the rest of the crowd. All right, Federico, I want to talk about cookie cutter apps because I know you mentioned this when you talked to Mike, and that's something that I've talked to you about privately before, that I notice a certain sameness with Swift UI apps. And I've wondered in the past where that's coming from. And on the one hand, I think there's a certain truth to the fact that Swift UI is still a very young technology, and as a result, what you can accomplish with it is somewhat limited, and that leads to UIs that look kind of similar from app to app, which I don't really personally like. Now, I've also seen developers take the counter position to that on Twitter, and I think maybe Steve Troughton-Smith did at one point, explain that, well, maybe, but it's also because with Swift UI, you have a lot of new, young, inexperienced developers flooding the App Store, and they're just kind of using the standard components and not really exploring what can be done, at the margins, basically. And I get that. I think that that's probably true. And it's interesting to me because on the one hand, I think it's a very good thing that we have Swift UI and that there are standard components that people can use because it lowers the bar to entry to new people. And new people is, it's new blood in the app store. It's new apps. It's people who will learn and develop, and at some point get to the point where they're making those innovative apps that surprise us. Maybe they don't surprise us today, but eventually they will. And so I think it's very good to have that. And I think we've seen that throughout the history of the App Store. I remember, when I did my app that I developed way back when, one of the reasons it still works, even today, even though it's not on the App Store, is because I use standard components. It was a very basic app with not a lot of, not a lot of custom stuff built into it. And that's a benefit both to the developers because it makes it cheaper, faster to iterate on the app. But it does also lend itself to a certain sameness. And so I think there's a tension there that is kind of, especially since Swift UI is so new, that's one reason we're seeing that sort of thing.
That is very true. I think it also happens in the context of developers and designers trying to hop on board of a trend, of a design trend.
True.
And we see this in waves, right? Maybe sometimes it's in the little things. Stuff like how to design a button, right? So there were periods when people were all drawing buttons with a certain shape or with a certain shadow or a certain color. And, there's these trends that come and go from skeuomorphism many years ago to the flat UIs, to typography, to now some developers wanting to do this neomorphism, which I don't really understand. But having trends, just like fashion, really, it leads to that sameness to an extent. And I think it's definitely a factor especially when you spend time on communities like Dribble, right, where designers can share concepts and mock-ups of the apps they're working on and trying to one-up each other in terms of graphical fidelity and pixel precision, that kind of stuff. But I think this used to be more the case years ago, especially with photorealistic UIs with 3D elements. But I think it's definitely, there's still some aspects of that in, because everybody's trying to look modern and everybody's trying to look like, they're following the latest trends. There's a component to that, sort of following the current style, following the current trend. But I also think that the limitations of Swift UI, because it's so young, they definitely lead to, developers bumping into the same restrictions. And if the restrictions apply to everyone, therefore there must be some sameness that everybody has to have just because of the nature of the language. And so I think the more Swift UI grows, the more those cookie cutter, stock elements will keep looking, will start looking different from each other.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that that's absolutely true. I think there is an element of it too, that everybody is learning these new technologies together. And so really the first step is just to make it work. And down the road, once people have figured out, where the margins are for Swift UI, there'll be more opportunities to actually iterate on it and change things around and customize it. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by RevenueCat. You're building something special, an experience that your users will love. Don't get bogged down in complex subscription code and receipt checking. Let RevenueCat do all of that for you. Using RevenueCat to power your app's in-app purchase solves for edge cases you don't even know that you have, and it protects you from outages your team hasn't seen yet. Plus, it saves you time on future maintenance and features released by the app stores. RevenueCat empowers your product and marketing teams with clean, reliable in-app purchase data so they can make better decisions to help your app grow. RevenueCat handles all of the headaches of building in-app purchase infrastructure so you don't have to. That way, you can get back to building the best app for your users. RevenueCat supports iOS, macOS, Android, and Stripe. They also make it easy to verify subscription status across multiple platforms. Try doing that yourself. It's not easy, unless, of course, you use RevenueCat. They provide all the tools you need to quickly set up and manage any in-app purchase model, from a simple to-do list app to complex cross-platform subscriptions. They have SDKs for iOS, iPadOS, watchOS, Android, React Native, Flutter, Cordova, Unity, and macOS, including Catalyst. And RevenueCat even has a free tier for side projects. It's free until you ship, even for the biggest apps, so you can spend more time building your app and not your subscription backend. It's harder than ever to stand out in the App Store. Don't spend time writing backend code for your subscription. Let RevenueCat do that while you focus on an experience that will surprise and delight your users. Relieve all your subscription worries by going to RevenueCat.com to get started for free. Again, that URL to get started for free is RevenueCat.com. Our thanks to RevenueCat for their support of App Stories. All right, Federico, before we talk about a few of the apps that have surprised us more recently, I thought it'd be interesting to also consider where are the innovations going to come from? The kind of innovations that are going to lead to the apps that will surprise us and excite us in the future. And I know you've got a couple of here. I think it's going to be a combination of things, both hardware and software, but I think hardware is probably, that's one of the areas that I find most intriguing, especially with a lot of the rumors that we've heard over the last year or two.
Yeah, in terms of hardware for, the 2 or 3 years down the road, I think there's definitely a lot of potential when it comes to things like folding devices, so folding phones and folding tablets, because that if Apple does it, they are going to do the whole thing in terms of it's not just that you're going to fold the display and the app will just expand open. They are going to, if they do it, knowing Apple, they are going to have all kinds of APIs, all kinds of systems for developers to adapt to the folding display. So that's definitely one thing. A bigger iPad could also be interesting, right? We talked about this before. Right. If Apple ever does a 15-inch or 16-inch iPad Pro, that could be interesting for developers. What does it mean for multitasking? What does it mean for multi-column layouts, for multiple windows? Definitely something that I would love to play with. And lastly, it's obvious, but if Apple is indeed working on a VR or mixed reality headset before they do the AR glasses, which seems to starting to sound like those are more of a 5 years down the road type of thing. But if they do a VR or mixed reality headset before, that's also a new platform. New platforms mean new apps, new experiences, and especially in the context of VR, could be interesting for games, could be interesting for productivity. And so new hardware usually spawns, a lot of new app experiences, which sometimes, like we saw when the Apple Watch launched years ago, they're not that great at the beginning, but they definitely are something new for us to play around with.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think if you look at the software side, there's room there too, because especially with the realignment of Mac OS and iPad OS, where they're a lot closer together now, I think that there's still a lot of room there for each of those platforms to learn more from the other. And that's just going to lead to more interesting apps on both. We've already seen that with Mac OS. We've got a lot of apps coming over from the iPad. And they're increasingly sophisticated versions of apps as well, including Craft, which is a Catalyst app. But I think that is also going to migrate down to the iPad as well. And I think that is where a lot of the Pro apps are going to come from in the future, is going to be bringing things to the iPad that haven't been there historically. And whether that's going to require a larger screen in some cases, maybe. But I think we're already at a point where the OSs are aligned in a way that we're going to start seeing that regardless of what the hardware looks like. I also kind of feel like our sights on what is surprising and exciting may need to maybe be a little more narrow in some respects, because I feel like the innovations you find today, you still, we're going to talk about some apps that have surprised us and excited us, but there are also just features. And I was thinking the other day about Genius Scan, because Genius Scan is a scanning app on the iPhone. And you know what? There are a lot of those, and I've tried a bunch of them, and there are a lot of good ones, but they came along and they used machine learning. And this is, getting to the aspect of this that we already talked about, which is taking advantage of Apple's latest machine learning AI technologies and that sort of thing. And they came up with a scanning app that does edge detection better than just about any other iPhone scanning app that I've seen. And that it's a small thing, yes, but it also is a thing that makes using the app much more easy and a lot more pleasant than in the past. So, I kind of keep my eye on that kind of thing now. And those are the kind of things that more often than the full app are surprising and kind of delighting me these days.
Give me some other examples of apps that have surprised you lately. I have my own list, but I think you also have some other and different apps from what I have. Like, what is something that surprised you, or that you're keeping an eye on because you're excited about it? Like, give me some names, John. Drop some names on me.
Drop some names. All right. Well, you know what? We talked about this at the beginning of the episode, but Fresco is a big part of this, because I did not expect to be as surprised by this app as I was. And I think the thing that Adobe really hit out of the park with this is that it works just as well if you're a beginning novice artist as it does if you're professional, because it's like a lot of little touches. It's things like the fact that when you open a new document, it's automatically selected the same basic pencil every time, which is great, because you know what? That's how a lot of professional artists start, by sketching out what their drawing is going to look like, or their painting. But it's also a good place for a beginner to start, just understanding how to use the Apple Pencil on a digital canvas. And then from there, you can kind of spread out and poke around other parts of the UI and understand what all the tools do and what's there. And on top of, I guess, little design touches like that, there's a lot of learning opportunities in the app. They've built in a lot of tutorials, a lot of social aspects, collaboration aspects. It's a really neat app, and it really shows the fact that it was built for the iPad from the start really shows here. I mean, Photoshop is a great app. Lightroom I like a lot too, but they have baggage, because they started out on the desktop. And especially, I think, if you're a creative professional in those areas, whether it's image editing or photography, you expect certain things because you've grown up on the desktop understanding what those apps can do. And you look at the iPad apps and you know what? They don't do as much. And if you're coming at it from that perspective, you're going to be disappointed to a degree. If you're someone like me, you probably, I find those apps great, because I don't use the desktop versions haven't used them for years. And so to me, they're great. But the thing about Fresco is that because it started on the iPad, nobody had any preconceived notions about what it should be. Yes, you can compare it to other things like, some of the Affinity tools or Procreate or whatever it is, but it was working from a clean slate. And I think that really shows when you look at it. And I, as someone who doesn't really do drawing and painting, I found it easy to get into it. I mean, I did poke around and watch. I watched a lot of tutorials to really understand what the more complex features are capable of, so I could talk about those. But just getting started, it was a piece of cake. And that app to me is really, a great example. I guess another one I would point to is the latest version of Carrot Weather, because this is an app to me that really shows what we've talked about a lot on this show about, which is customization. And it's a degree of customization that extends to every corner of the UI in a way that I don't think we've really seen anywhere else before. And when I first saw it, I mean, I was really kind of shocked by it, because when we got that beta, I was like, well, I already liked Carrot Weather, and now Carrot Weather can be totally different from what it was before. It can really be almost anything you want it to be, because there's so many different data points that can be incorporated and different design decisions and looks. And in the end, at first that was a little jarring because I wasn't expecting it. But in the end, I really like it. I like it a lot more, and I hope to see more apps doing that kind of thing, especially where it's an app like that, where you're not creating in the app. It's not a text. You wouldn't want that with your text editor necessarily, I don't think. But where it's delivering information to you, doing it in a way that is customized the way that the information you want to see and the way you want to see it, I think makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's a really good example. We mentioned craft so many times. I think it's kind of obvious that this is, I would say, the app that surprised me the most in 2020. Not just because it's a great app, but because of just how remarkable its 1.0 version was. And
yeah, I agree.
The level of maturity and all the different features packed into a new app for multiple platforms, with such polish, with such great design. It's so rare to find these days, and the developers they're continuing to work on it. They have weekly updates on all platforms, and they are expanding to different platforms as well. I think it's really one of those examples of something new that comes along and upends the market. And I think if you are into note-taking apps and trying new note-taking apps on your devices and you haven't considered Craft yet, you're really missing out on some of the... I think it's the most exciting app that came out in 2020. I also want to mention a couple of more things. Tayo, which again, talked about it at the beginning of the show. It surprised me because it went back to this idea that I had left behind years ago of the extensible text editor, which I sort of lost all hopes regarding that type of application when editorial was discontinued. And
Right.
So bringing back that idea in a modern way, in the context of iPadOS 14, and so modern multitasking, multi-window, and having that shortcuts-inspired automation editor, combining a text editor and a clipboard manager into one. It surprised me because it's a unique app. It's a unique app where the developers can say, we are building something that literally nobody else is working on at the moment. And that's by definition something exciting. I also want to mention this new indie app made by a single person. It's called Scan Thing. It's literally the name of the app. It's Scan Thing. And It's a unique scanning application for iPhone, iPad, and it came out on the Mac last week. And what's unique about it is that it's totally offline, totally private, runs on device. And what it can do, like you've seen a bunch of scanning apps before, right? And they can extract text from images, from PDF documents. So Scan Thing can do that. But what it can also do is it uses machine learning to extract objects and people and pets, or your hand, literally any object. It can extract stuff from images. And you really got to try it to see what I mean. So you take a photo of I took a picture of my dog a few days ago with Scan Thing. And then you run it through the app, and it cuts all the background, and it just gives you a PNG of your dog. And I also tested it with my hand holding the a TV remote, and you took a picture with Scan Thing, and it extracts just the remote. And you can do this with plants, with a Nintendo Switch, any object that you wanna extract from a photo. You can do that with Scan Thing. And it's this unique spin on a scanning app for iPhone that, yes, you can also extract text from images and PDFs, but really the object and sort of people and animal extraction, if you will, that's what makes it unique. And it's one of those things that when I first saw it months ago, I was like, well, this is something that I've never seen done before.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's still possible, right? It
Right.
proves the point that it is still possible to have that special something that makes you stand out. And lastly, I want to mention regarding what I said about finding your special something along the way. I think Good Task is a great example of this, because Good Task has been around for years as a reminders client, as a more powerful version of reminders for Apple platforms. But I think it's only in the last year that the Good Task developer sort of found its calling, found the app's calling, if you will, in terms of betting heavily on customization and
Right.
allowing users to customize everything in the app, from the sidebar, quick actions, widgets, themes. Now the fonts, you can also change the fonts
Yeah,
now.
I saw that.
You can customize all kinds of things. And I think it's that, finding that unique something about your app along the way is also it's also important to note how it can be something you discover after years of working on a product. Doing this for a living, and you do it long enough and you cover all the basics, and then you stumble upon something and you realize, well, you know what? Maybe this is something that I could invest on to make my app stand out even more. And I think the Good Task developer, Hambum Kim, did an excellent job at finding that and identifying that and continuing to iterate on it. So now the customization in Good Task, now it's incredible. And it's one of the main reasons why I love using it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I would also, you might wonder what would you use Scan Things' ability to extract items for? And I immediately think of things like Photoshop. I mean, if you have an app that can extract portions of an image that well, then you can drop them into other creative apps and build something new by remixing various components. All right, Federico, that's it for this week. That was a great conversation. I think it'll be interesting to see what 2021 brings, and I'm looking forward to WWC because there are always surprises that are enabled by the new technologies that we see there, and it's really just around the corner. So it's time for us to start getting ready. I want to thank our three sponsors again, and that is Crypto Pro, Delete Me, and Revenue Cat. You can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram, where he's at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.